Is this on? Yeah, okay. I know why you all came back, and that's lunch. This morning's, the first half was obviously the why and the biblical mandate. Now let's talk about, how do we establish, if your church doesn't have anything towards setting up a security team. These are some guidelines that I've put together. I'm not going to, boast that it's everything that you could imagine. It is what I have gleaned from, this church and this organization, and that organization, combined with my law enforcement and private security background, and put it together. And obviously the title is Gatekeepers. I think, that's scriptural. That's James's group. They call themselves the Gatekeepers, and I think it's a good title. So, in my opinion, you can't be a team member in church security unless you're a professed and immersed believer in Jesus Christ. Okay? How can you have the love if you're not? And we all know there's some good people out there that are not Christians that in some cases they outshine us in their display of love, but it's got to start right there. Okay? I think team members should also agree and make a commitment to daily prayer and reading God's Word. And there's all kinds of scripture references that are going to attest to that. I believe we have to agree to faithfully attend. We've got to support the body. We have to have a good attitude and pray for each other. And this is kind of a big one for me. My dad preaching coming out. You got to faithfully support the church with our tithes and our offerings. If I am unwilling to give a tithe and offering to the church, how can I honestly say that I'm willing to go and sacrifice my life for the same church? I mean, to me, that when I withhold from God, my heart is not right. So I believe that is a big component. And then last on that list, again, is promoting unity and my attitude. Is my attitude a sweet aroma? Okay? It should be. I can honestly say it's not always, but I like to grumble and gripe. How many other Marines are out there? What are we best at? Complaining. Yes. So I gotta leave the Marine mentality of complaining behind, and I've got to support, even when I don't 100% agree with the leadership. I need to support the leadership. Okay. The biggest thing that I think needs to be in our guideline or our policy as a team, aside from how to select those people, is how do we deal with difficult people? It's pretty easy, when madman comes in with a gun, I need to go shoot that guy. Okay, that's obvious in my role. But what do I do with the person that is argumentative, confrontational? They're there to pick a fight verbally. How do I deal with that person? And that's a tender subject. It can cause a lot of division and disharmony in the church with how we handle that. Is that even our responsibility? Or should the pastors, go and subject themselves to pulling that person aside? That's something that has to be discussed. It has to have a clear guideline set forth in the security team policy. Okay? Church leadership can't just set this policy without collaborating with the team members, though, because there's going to be some risks that are going to be left unfocused on if we don't work together. Okay? Now, I honestly cannot say, you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to do this as far as dealing with difficult people. That's something that you and your little group need to have open dialogue. How do you want us to handle this, Pastor? How do you want us to handle this, elders? When somebody does this or such. Okay? I can tell you what we're going to do if they jump up with a gun in their hand. Okay? That much is easy. But the less severe actions, that's where it gets a little bit more difficult. Best way is to have clear and less complicated guidelines. Sometimes less is best. Okay? Our primary purpose, after all, is to share the gospel and not to allow Satan to use a disruptive force to interfere with the message. So while we got to intervene, our response must never be in anger or with the appearance of hate. And that's sometimes really tough to do. Mr. Williford that intervened there in Sutherland, Texas, he made a comment where he shouted some rude, words to the guy. Stress does that, but if he wasn't a Christian, I'm sure it would have been even worse. I'm sure his attitude wouldn't have maybe been quite as, I'm doing this out of love and compassion for my fellow man. It might have been hate-filled. Definitely wouldn't have been the Holy Spirit working through him as well. Okay. Tool of Satan might very well be the mission field. So that disruptive influence that you're dealing with today that's causing a problem, arguing with the youth leader or the children's care staff or whatever, how we handle them, if we handle them with love until the point that we can't, may very well bring that person to the right side. Some other team member responsibilities that we really have to work on or have in guidelines or, of course, how to handle deadly force incidents. And the number one thing in that is our job is to stop the threat. Okay? Sounds simple, sounds easy. Stopping the threat means I'm going to go and I'm going to be willing to sacrifice my life or put my life in between the rest of the body of Christ and use force, unless there's some other alternative. Okay? I have to provide some overwatch. Okay? This is kind of one of the most boring jobs, if you will, that you can get as far as ministry. Because unless things really go bad, you just walk around and get seen. It's really hard to stay motivated sometimes when there's no excitement. Of course, we don't want that excitement, but it's at the same time, it's hard to stay vigilant all the time. So our presence, our overwatch, and our desire has got to be focused on how do I continue to look for threats that I've never seen. Evacuations due to fires, gas leaks, man-made emergencies, and the like. This is something that most churches see fit to fit in that security and safety realm as well. These are, something that obviously aren't quite as dangerous. They can be, but they aren't quite as dangerous as somebody, running around shooting everybody that they can, see or find or put their sights on in the church. And so we need to have clear expectations of what the staffs on the team is supposed to do when a fire happens. My church, I go to Carterville Christian Church there in the Webb City area, and we just recently had a kitchen fire. Nothing major. One of the youth ministers or youth leaders left a pan of brownies on a burner on top of a stove and of course it caught fire, and fire alarms went off and caused a lot of panic, and we realized, oops, we really didn't handle that too well. Because what happened when we have an incident? Everybody runs to it. And so a majority of the building and facility was left with ne'er a security person providing overwatch. Well, it's something we got to fix. We cannot allow whatever it is to draw us away from our assigned duties. Okay? So we have to have those guidelines established so that we all know and can remember what our job and duties are. Inclement weather plans. Could we ever have a tornado here? Yeah, sure. That gets lumped onto security staff from time to time as well. Not that I disagree with it, but, how are we supposed to handle that? Do we set aside our security hat when that happens and just focus on evacuation or getting people to shelter? I don't think we can ever take our security function completely off of our plate, okay? Because bad things can happen while some other bad thing is happening, okay? Same with fires. How many of you recall the Jonesboro school shooting back in the late 90s? Couple? Specifics behind that are a prime example of why we cannot set aside our security role to focus on some other kind of emergency exclusively. Situation in that was two kids wanted to commit a mass atrocity. They went in, one pulled the fire alarm, can't talk, knowing that the kids are going to funnel out a specific exit, and they just sat up there and waited and ambushed kids as they flowed out of the school. So it looked like a fire, looked like nothing, hey, the danger's over here, let's go over here, and they funneled right into danger. Okay, so security has got to be goal number one, is deadly force prevention or stoppage. And then the last of the primary functions that or responsibilities that team members need to be trained in and have a plan for is emergency medical. This issue didn't used to really weigh too heavily on me until I got shot. And as I'm applying a tourniquet to my thigh, I realized, you know what, maybe more people should be trained at least in a small amount with how to treat that wound. And the two contract instructors that I have that do the medical stuff, one of them told me, 10% of those killed in Vietnam could still be alive had they been trained in how to stop blood leaking from extremities, utilizing a tourniquet. We're talking almost 6,000 people died in Vietnam from extremity wounds that were treatable with a tourniquet. That's pretty important. You think about it, mass shooting guy comes in, shoots a bunch of people. Not all those people die instantaneously. They're dying of blood loss in most cases. Okay? So if we can either train ourselves to protect ourselves or our family members with tourniquet use and blood stop techniques, and we may keep a lot more people alive than otherwise. And it doesn't have to be just shooting. One of my medical instructors, he was a sergeant on the police department when the tornado rolled through Joplin in 2011. He used over 160 tourniquets in one day. Of course, he didn't have 160 tourniquets. He had to fashion things into tourniquets. I couldn't tell you how many people are alive because of, his knowledge and ability to find and use what was readily available to save life. So the medical aspect is, to me, a really big importance for our team. How do we communicate as a team? Well, if we took this structure as an example, and how many people do you think would need to have to provide good, adequate security if we don't have radio communication? It's going to be at least double or triple. Having some simple radios with earpieces so that guys can communicate to each other and tell where the threats are or where coverage is needed or lacking or where a problem pops up, that's a force multiplier. Okay? I'm sure your church is no different than my church. You never have enough bodies to handle all the needs. And so in the case of communication, I think it's a huge point a huge consideration that we've got to supply these team members with the equipment needed to do the job. And that starts with good radio communications. Secondly, less effective, it would be text or email alerts. I almost hate to even suggest that as an option. It sounds great to an administrator because it's virtually free. Everybody's got a cell phone in this day and age almost. But, how many times does your phone go dingle-dingle and you just hit the silent and ignore it? How are you going to know that that's, James calling for backup? Or, calling, hey, I think there's some suspicious guy sitting out on the parking lot, So it goes back, again, to good radio communication. How many of your churches have a PA that it can be used to announce throughout the building of some kind of an incident? Most probably do. We at least have speakers in the auditorium that we can announce to the big bulk of those worshiping that something's going on. But is it appropriate to just blast out, a code word or, that there's a threat going on? Maybe, maybe not. But it definitely can be used in the case of a fire or a storm or some other type of man-made incident that we need to get people's attention for. And lastly is good verbal communication. And that sounds so obvious and so simplistic. But, you've probably heard the old analogy of, you have 5 people lined up and the first person has a story and he tells the second person and it's supposed to be repeated on down the line, and by the time it gets down to the 5th person, the story doesn't sound much like the first one that was told. Verbal communication has its purpose, but we as a team need to meet together, we need to fellowship together, and we need to line out how we communicate certain things. As simple as, how do I direct people to the front of the building? This is a church that I did a presentation for here a month or so ago. I like using a number system versus northeast, south, and west. There's a lot of folks that I will say, are directionally challenged. Okay, are you one of those folks that, north, it's easy to get turned around, but it's very simple. I think, maybe I'm oversimplistic, maybe it's my, SWAT background, but we would number the sides of our building, and then you just can't do it one time and say, hey, yeah, that everybody's got this. Yeah, no, you got to talk about it. Okay, your main access road side is the one side, and then it goes in clockwise. And if there's any of those young generational only digital people, go to Grandma and Grandpa's house, and next to the rotary dial phone there will be a round clock, and 12 o'clock is at the top, and watch the hands until you learn what clockwise is. But I've found that, numbering the sides of the building versus trying to guide north, northeast, you just say, hey, there's a problem with the 1-2 side. Okay? And that's going to send them to that corner. Okay? Little simple things, but it really boils down to, we've got to meet together. This can't be something we set up a meeting, we have, or set up a team, we have one meeting, and then we never meet and talk to each other again, except, are you taking radio number 2? I'm taking radio number 3. We can't expect that we're going to be on the same page if we don't work together. Okay? It doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be lengthy. It can be 10, 15, 20 minutes, an hour. It could be a lunch together, as a team once a month, once a quarter, something along that lines. Okay? Team member placement. How many people have ever heard of the onion principle? 1 or 2. We called it the onion principle. Onions have lots and lots of layers. And any good security program should follow the onion layer or the onion principle. We cannot just have one layer of security. It's so easily penetrated, defeated if you have one layer. So you have your perimeter or external layer, for instance. That external layer may not even be an armed security person. It may be a parking lot attendant. Our church has all the entrances to the parking lot with greeters, essentially. They're waving, they're standing next to a sign that says visitors show up here for parking instructions, and they're doing the job of being friendly. Okay? Now, that sounds well and good. Those folks are in a whole lot of danger, really and truly, honestly, because most of them aren't armed. Okay? And if they don't have some manner of telling security team that there's a problem, then they may just be cannon fodder. All right? So if we equip those, or if you have that kind of ministry already in place, empower them through radio communications to talk to security and say, I think we've got a problem here. Okay? My eyes aren't as good as they used to be. Then we have our internal layers. Okay? So we have our external layers, we have our internal layers. Internal layers could be everything from roving patrols, but specifically we probably need to have, when you have 200 people in one spot, that's a high-risk area. We need to put somebody in a high-risk area, maybe one or two, depending on how big your team is. Number one, in my opinion, is the youth and child areas. We're all adults. We're all physically more capable than most of the children. And so, therefore, we really need to focus heavily on guarding, the least capable. Okay? Somebody should be in the youth area all the time. I personally believe that a part of that layer in the youth area is also, to the best extent possible, we need to limit the amount of entrances into that youth area. We need to control the funneling of potential threats. Doesn't mean you need to go board up doors. It just means doors need to be locked, okay, with fire exits only. And then security needs to check those doors to make sure some bad guy hasn't snuck in, propped the door open, unarmed, and then went back outside to bring in their arsenal. Okay, so that inner layer around the high-risk areas are highly important. Offering and collection. Okay, storage areas for that. If you really think about it, is the church immune to robbery? No. In fact, we didn't specifically read that entire text in 1 Chronicles 9, but it charged the gatekeepers with protecting the treasuries. And logically, if you think about it, I don't know how big of a congregation you serve in, but your church is going to bring in more cash than the 7-Eleven. Once bad guys figure that out, it's only a matter of time before somebody tries to come to your church and knock off an offering. So, we better be aware of it. We better know where, when the ushers or those that are passing the plate meet back together to lump it all together, somebody needs to be there with it. And they need to escort it all the way to the safe or where it's secured. Okay? That's pretty important. And then again, roving patrols. Intermittent roving patrols that are harder for a educated or well-tuned in criminal element from being able to predict where you're going to be next. Okay? Of course, all that boils down to how many people do you have to serve in that function. You may have 2 or 3 in your congregation, and you're going to be stretched really thin, and there are going to be weaknesses. There are going to be gaps, without a doubt. I don't think we can turn the church into the proverbial max security prison. All right, but it is definitely something that we need to think about. Okay. Some other placement considerations that you as a team member or your team members need to think about is, what is the engagement distance that I might find myself in location X? If you're an external perimeter person, guess what? You better be really good with your firearm skills. Okay? Which brings me to the topic. What is the average engagement distance with a pistol? Pretty doggone close, yeah. If you listen to some pretty dated statistics, this close. You're within almost arm's reach 70% of the time in a handgun fight. All right? Church security is a totally different ballgame, though. We're not talking about a personal incident where somebody comes up to you and holds a knife on you, or, is at the bank teller station, and you're looking over and you see a gun. We're talking about a whole different dynamic. So you could be in that exterior perimeter just like the guy in Sutherland, Texas, and he's shooting 30, 40 yards across the street into the church building. How many of you feel confident, those of you that are armed and carry pistols, how many of you feel confident that you can make a pretty fast shot at 35 yards with your pistol? It's not very realistic, is it? Okay? Now, I'm not saying to trade in your pistol and pick up a rock or something. What I am saying is we logically need to think about this. More and more people are attacking with rifles. I'll tell you from my Marine mentality, my pistol is just to get me to my rifle. Okay? If I know I'm going to war, I'm carrying the biggest, the baddest, tool that I've got in the safe. Okay? For multiple years, I had my AR in the trunk. Didn't tell anybody about it. And it was kind of one of those things I just say, I don't know how they're going to look at this, am I, there goes old crazy Grant again, paranoid about everything, wanting us to carry rifles around. And then that Sutherland Springs thing happened, and, he'd have been up a creek without a paddle had he not had a rifle. That could have went on and on and on and on and on. Before I cut that video off, or after I cut that video off, there's a part where he talked about how many rounds and other weapons the guy in Sutherland, Texas had. He most likely was not going to stop at the First Baptist Church. He definitely could have went on. That much for sure. No one knows but God what his intent was that day after Sutherland Springs. But without a doubt, he had the weaponry, he had the ammunition that he could have carried that fight on for a long time. Okay? So if you're carrying a pistol and you've got your one magazine, you are under-equipped. And you're fooling yourself. Okay? We got to live in the real world. If I need to carry a gun, I better carry some extra bullets. I better have a plan if the fight and the engagement distance is extended beyond my personal abilities with that firearm. I need to think about obstacles, cover and concealment. What can I stay behind? Where can I push people that they can get behind that's going to stop bullets? Where are my exits? What backstop do I have if a bad guy comes in one of the exits? Where backstop means where are my bullets going to go if I miss or they pass through my intended target? I need to be thinking about those considerations. If the youth room is right on the other side of that entrance, I may not want to position myself where I'm firing directly into that youth room. Okay? Dead is dead. It doesn't matter by whose hand. It's still tragic. So I've got to think about those things ahead of time. Like I said, exits, run, fight, or hide. Hiding is all the cool, politically correct way of addressing these problems. And let me ask, has hiding worked in any school? No. And we, as the church, I like to say the church gets it. we ascribe to more logic than the secular world in a lot of things. Just hunkering down and waiting for the death angel to come to you, that's not really working anywhere. Hasn't as of yet, but they're just doubling down on stupid. Okay, so we need to think about running if you're unarmed, or getting people to run if they're unarmed, instead of you wait here. Okay, unless you got security prepared and capable that are able to protect that body. What do we do in the police response? Okay, this one gets brought up a lot. If we arm people in church, then the police are going to show up and they're going to mistake our people for the bad guys, and the police are going to shoot us. That's a real concern. Not going to lie. The sad fact, though, is if the fight is still going by the time the police get there, it's a bad day. And I've been very blessed in the break to have, quite a few, former law enforcement guys here in the audience come up and tell me some of their experiences, and I'm as pro-police as you can possibly get, and I know that they are as well. And it's not any fault of the police, but bad guys don't attack police stations, usually. They're attacking the absence of security, or at least the appearance of the absence of security. So that delay, you think about it, from the first shot, we've got to realize what's going on. Okay? And if you paid attention in that video, he didn't even notice it. His daughter had to come tell him something's going on. You hear that? And he sounds like somebody tapping on the window. How many minutes were lost in that situation? And it wasn't just them. It's everywhere. Anybody that called the police in that situation, the police never got there. They were on the highway chasing the guy before the police ever got there. And that's not an argument against the police. God, we love the police. We need the police. But it comes down to, if we don't have it in place, the death toll is going to be astronomical. So about the only time that in theory, unless there just happened to be an officer pull out of the alleyway behind the church when the whole thing went down, the only probability of a police officer running into an armed security member is if there's some kind of a standoff. Church security has confronted that person, they've exchanged shots, the bad guys hunkered down in a back corner in a room or something, and they're keeping him at bay. And in that situation, it's fairly simple to just select somebody in the team to go out and meet the police in the parking lot and guide them in so that they can, one, find out where the problem is, and two, know that there's armed security on site. I hate to be oversimplistic, but let's be matter of fact about it. Usually there's a very lengthy delay, and these are not usually long and drawn out situations. They're over and done with, and the carnage is concluded pretty quickly. It happens super fast. Okay. Some post-incident care. All right, things you can expect. The church is now a crime scene. You're going to lose your facilities for some period of time, or at least access to them. Okay, this may not be something that we as the lower level echelon leadership are as concerned about, but it still is going to come into play. You're going to lose your firearm if you pulled the trigger. And I don't want to say that that's no big deal. I've got a safe full of them. there's something about having your gun taken away from you in that incident that is unnerving. I'll never forget when they took my firearm away from me the first time. I felt naked without it. I really did. It was like, I almost felt like they were telling me I did something wrong. I mean, I understood why, but I felt like, there's 25 guys sitting around my first shooting. They knew what went on. They knew it was justified. Why am I getting listed in the suspect column? But it's what you can expect. Do you have a plan for how you're going to handle the questioning of law enforcement? Do you have a plan for hiring an attorney? After all, if you used a firearm, shot and killed somebody, you're kind of on the hot seat, so to speak. How much do you think an attorney is going to cost you as an individual in that circumstance? Retainer is usually around $10,000. It's fairly substantial. So, question might need to be brought up. How do I plan for that or prepare for that? Okay. One, I got to be a wise steward of my own money, but two, I might want to get some kind of an insurance plan, or I might need to bring it up to the church leadership of whether they want to take on some kind of umbrella policy that covers attorney expenses in that situation. Okay. My advice to anybody who's been involved in a shooting is, except for the very basic information, you should not make a statement to the police for at least 3 days. Okay, it's actually just 3 full sleep cycles. Okay, now that doesn't mean you're to deny that you've been involved in the shooting. It doesn't mean that you can't help them with certain components, but to sit down in an interview room and go step by step through that process, if you try to do it the same day, you're going to make a whole lot of mistakes in your statement. Because your mind is going to be extremely messed up in that point, overwhelmed. You'll forget key details. I couldn't remember what hand the guy was holding the knife in. It's a pretty important detail. And especially, I think, as a Christian, we see authority in a different light than the rest of the world. We see God as the ultimate authority. Police are an extension of God's authority, so we respect them, or we should. And so we want to answer their questions. We want to be helpful. We want to fill in the blanks. And as they start asking us details, and we get to some detail that we don't have an answer for, we just have this compulsive urge to kind of fill in a blank. And that blank may not have been filled in with the appropriate and correct information. It wasn't that we intended to lie. It wasn't that we intended to deceive or mislead the investigation. It just, we don't have an answer for it that day. So all the psychologists that I've been subjected to says 3 sleep cycles. With 3 full sleep cycles, and that may be a week for you. I didn't sleep for 2.5 days after my first shooting. Couldn't turn off the video player in my head. I was sick. It's like I had more stomach acid produced in that couple 3 days than I'd ever experienced in my whole life. Nothing tasted good. Nothing set on my stomach right. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything. But you know what Grant Lavelle did after his first shooting? I got to be a good officer. I got to type my report. Ooh. there was quite a few flaws in that report, not to mention typos. Ooh, that was before the days of Windows. That was green screen, computers. Yeah, these kids today, they don't know the struggles we had. Now, some of you are out there like, oh, whatever, I typed with a chisel and a hammer into stone, and you want to talk about how long it took me to make my police report up? There was no spell check back then. Okay, so be kind to yourself. You're not being unhelpful. You're actually wanting to avoid misleading the investigation. All right? And then how do you deal with that trauma aftermath? Part of the video that I cut off there, Williford talked about, I think I need to go see a counselor. And I was one of those, tough guys, or tried to put on the image of a tough guy. I went to war, I dealt with that. It was totally different when you're the one that pulled that trigger. My first shooting, a guy had tried to kill his wife, and then he tried to kill several officers, and I ended up shooting and killing him. And in the investigation post-shooting, they'd found his Bible, and he had opened his Bible to John 3:16, circled it, signed his name, and dated it. And I'm assuming he did this right before he walked out of the house and I shot him. Boy, you want to talk about making a Christian hurt. I suffered with that for years. Why would one believer put another believer in that position? We do it all the time as believers. We hurt each other. Sometimes we mean to, sometimes we don't. But you're going to need some counseling after this deal. Okay? And I'm just saying, after you get done listening to me, you're going to need some counseling. No, you end up shooting somebody. If you have a good heart, a good conscience, you're going to need some counseling. If you're a psychopath, man, killing people is no big deal. But you can expect you're going to need to talk to somebody about it. And it may not be good enough to go talk to your pastor. They're too close. They're too connected to it. I went and tried to talk to my dad after my shooting, and I will tell you, I did not get anything good. And I love my dad. I think the world of my dad. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to relate to me. My dad kind of is one of those that I think he leans more towards the pacifist viewpoint. He never condemned me, but it was like a struggle. There was too much emotion between us for him to offer me true comfort. It wasn't until after my first shooting, or it wasn't until after my second shooting, that they literally sent me to a psychologist who helped me and my wife, because by the time the second shooting rolled around, she'd had 13 months of dealing with a crazy person, and helped her walk through it. So we have to think about those things. We also need to set guidelines and policies in what it means to be a team member as far as your responsibilities outside of just where you stand and what you will look for and how you go and deal with a particular situation. But, you're being asked to use force. Well, I better know the law if I'm going to be asked to use force. Okay? Does your team talk about it? Does your team train on understanding what the state of Missouri, in my case, or wherever you are, says you have to do this and this and this? Is it reasonable and necessary? Et cetera, et cetera. Are you getting training in medical? I talked about that as a function of the security team, But have you taken any steps? It's not enough to just say, I'm going to pull out a tourniquet and I'm going to put it on this guy. Well, what if you don't have a tourniquet? How are you going to fashion a tourniquet? When do you use a tourniquet properly? Where on that body? All those things. They're not overly complicated things, but we need to have training in them. Okay? Am I proficient in my firearms use? Okay? Wilford obviously was a decent shot. Do you have to be an instructor to be on the security team? No. You don't have to be a distinguished, expert in firearms to be on the team. But we need to take it seriously. The other day I heard a statistic that just kind of made my stomach rumble. It said, and I don't know if this is factual, I hope it's not, but it said only 7% of gun carriers in America actually train. Man, that's alarming if that's factual. And I'll be honest with you, I believe it. I've been training for 27 years, and I have tried to train police officers. and police officers especially, we have kind of a chip on our shoulder sometimes. I don't want to look bad. I don't want to be critiqued. It's so laborsome to go to a class. But if you take on this responsibility, we have to be proficient. We have to maintain those skills. Shooting skills are perishable. It's kind of like being in the Word. If you read the Bible once, does it mean you know everything? Heck no. I've got to read that thing every day if I'm going to sink it into this dense skull. If I'm going to carry a handgun or a firearm, I better train and be proficient. I personally believe that not only should there be standards listed for that church group, but there should be some type of qualification that says this person has been selected and they can meet this standard. Now, what qualification? It's a title that a lot of people make it into something that it's not. Really, it's just a minimum standard. Okay, so a minimum standard has to be set forth. It's not some over the top, we're not training SEAL Team 6 here, okay? It's great if you have those kind of skills, but even SEALs aren't that great. If there's any SEALs here, we'll duke it out on the parking lot later. I've trained enough SEALs to know that not all of them are, the Hollywood version. But we've got to set forth a minimum qualification, okay? And we have to be judged by that minimum qualification. The church is still going to incur some liability, okay? By having a security team. Now, it's probably going to incur some liability if you don't, though. It's getting to that point. So which roll of the dice do you want to take? And then I personally believe team members should also be held accountable as to what they personally invest in the team. I do not believe that the church should fund a person's skill development completely. Again, it's a sacrificial thing. In fact, when I first started getting contacted by churches, wanting me to come and yak at them, I felt really uneasy about it. It wasn't that I didn't believe in church security. I just didn't know that I wanted to accept money from a church to talk about it. I think, if I want to fill that role, I need to step up, and I need to invest in me. The tithes and offerings, to a certain extent, I know they go to a lot of things, but it shouldn't be absorbed into people. I need to invest personally. Okay, so a standard, it needs to be achievable. It can't be ridiculous. It has to be budget-minded for the individuals that are on the team. But is it unrealistic to say, if you're going to be on the church security team, you must attend a concealed carry class and train 50 rounds every month or every quarter. I don't think that's ridiculous. I don't think that's too much to expect. A box of bullets is $10, and most calibers are right around that point. Even if it's double, $20 a month, that's not a big expenditure. I cannot take my family to the fine establishment at McDonald's for $20. Yes, I am refined connoisseur of soy products. So, in a nutshell, very rarely are large, complicated, and complex plans achievable. I think we need to have some written down expectations as a church, both with who we're going to select, because you're going to get people just coming out of the woodwork when you announce it that are going to want to volunteer for it. And some of them's mindset is, I want to be seen as the tough guy. I want your permission to carry a gun. And even though that statement isn't necessarily bad, it may not be the best attitude to have. So we must set forth those standards of who we allow to be in that position. We need to have clearly defined objectives. This is job number 1, job number 2, job number 3, job number 4. Okay? And this is how we're going to take care of it, and this is the training that we need to work on so that this group of men and women can work together in that role. Fairly straightforward, fairly explanatory, but like I said, I like to keep things as simple as possible.